Some men are born into darkness, others find their way there. Dean O'Banion did both, a choir boy who became Chicago's most charming killer, a florist who controlled the city's bootlegging empire. A Catholic who carried a rosary in one pocket and a gun in the other. When he was gunned down in his flower shop in 1924, the men who killed him thought they were ending a problem. Instead, they started a war that would consume hundreds of lives and make Chicago the murder capital of America. Chicago, 1924. The city pulsed with an energy unlike anywhere else in America. Jazz spilled from speakeasies hidden in basements and back alleys. Flappers danced in smoke-filled rooms where illegal whiskey flowed as freely as water. The 18th Amendment had banned alcohol across the nation, but in Chicago, prohibition didn't mean people stopped drinking. It just meant someone was going to get very, very rich making sure they could. That someone was Dean O'Banion, or at least he was one of them. And for a while, that arrangement worked just fine. But to understand how one man's greed could spark a 5-year war that would leave hundreds dead and transform organized crime in America forever, you need to understand where Dean O'Banion came from. Because his story isn't just about gangsters and guns. It's about a boy from a small Illinois town who learned early that in Chicago, the only thing that mattered was power, and the only way to get power was to take it. Charles Dean O'Banion was born on July 8, 1892, in the tiny town of Maroa, Illinois. His parents were Irish Catholics, hardworking people trying to make an honest living in a country that promised opportunity but delivered hardship. His mother, Emma, was the heart of their small family. His father worked whatever jobs he could find. For the first 9 years of Dean's life, Maroa was all he knew, a quiet place where everyone knew everyone else, where the biggest excitement might be the county fair or a church social. Then in 1901, everything changed. Emma O'Banion died. The exact cause has been lost to history, but the effect was immediate and devastating. Dean's father, Charles, couldn't manage alone. He packed up his sons and moved north to Chicago, leaving behind Dean's sister Ruth with relatives. The family that had been whole was now fractured, and the boy who might have grown up tending gardens in a small town was about to be thrown into one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in America. They settled in Kilgubbin, a section of Chicago's north side that newspapers called Little Hell, and the name fit. This wasn't a neighborhood, it was a battlefield. Packed with Irish immigrants struggling to survive, the streets of Kilgubbin teemed with poverty, violence, and crime. Children grew up fast here, or they didn't grow up at all. The law was a distant concept, something that happened to other people in other parts of the city. In Little Hell, you made your own rules or you followed someone else's. Young Dean O'Banion, Deanie to his friends, did something unexpected. He joined the choir at Holy Name Cathedral. His voice was beautiful, a clear Irish tenor that rang through the massive church during Mass. He looked like an angel standing there in his choir robes, his face scrubbed clean, his hair combed neat. The priests had high hopes for him. Perhaps they thought here was a boy who could rise above his circumstances. But outside the cathedral, on the streets of Little Hell, Dean O'Banion was learning a very different set of lessons. He fell in with other boys who had also lost parents, who also saw nothing but struggle in honest work, who understood that the quickest way to get ahead was to take what you wanted. 3 of these boys would become his closest friends, his brothers in everything but blood. Earl Weiss, who everyone called Jaime, a Polish kid as tough as they came. Vincent Drucci, clever and scheming. And George Morin, who would earn the nickname Bugs for his explosive temper. Together, these 4 boys formed the core of what would eventually become the North Side Gang, but that came later. First, they were just kids trying to survive, and they joined a street gang called the Market Streeters. These weren't the organized criminals of later years. They were thieves and pickpockets, beating up newsstand owners who wouldn't sell the right papers, lifting wallets from drunk men stumbling home from the bars, breaking into stores after dark. Dean O'Banion had a gift for it. He was charming, quick-witted, with a smile that could disarm almost anyone. People liked him, they trusted him, and that made it so much easier to rob them blind. By the time he was a teenager, O'Banion had already been arrested for burglary and assault, but he never spent serious time in jail. He was too smart for that, always managing to talk his way out of trouble or finding someone else to take the blame. The real education came when O'Banion and his friends got involved in the newspaper circulation wars. This might sound harmless, but in Chicago at the turn of the century, newspaper distribution was a violent business. The major papers, the Tribune and the Examiner, competed fiercely for readers, and they hired gangs of young men to make sure their papers sold and the competition didn't. These sluggers would beat up rival newsboys, destroy bundles of competing papers, and terrorize shop owners into carrying only their employer's publication. O'Banion worked for Moses Annenberg, a powerful figure in the newspaper wars who controlled distribution for the Chicago Examiner. Annenberg recognized talent when he saw it, and O'Banion had talent. He was fearless in a fight but smart enough to avoid unnecessary risks. He knew how to organize other men, how to inspire loyalty, and how to get results. Through Annenberg, O'Banion met political bosses in the 42nd and 43rd wards, men who needed muscle to ensure elections went the right way. This was Chicago politics at its most raw. Elections weren't won by better policies or inspiring speeches. They were won by making sure the right people voted and the wrong people stayed home. O'Banion and his crew would stand outside polling places, watching who came and went. If someone tried to vote for the wrong candidate, they might find themselves beaten in an alley. If someone who should have voted for the right candidate didn't show up, they might get a visit that convinced them to reconsider. It was dirty work, but it paid well. More importantly, it taught O'Banion how the real power structure in Chicago worked. The gangsters answered to the politicians, and the politicians answered to money. Laws were just words on paper that could be bent or broken if you had the right connections. Violence wasn't a last resort, it was a business tool, used as casually as a handshake or a contract. In the evenings, O'Banion worked as a singing waiter at McGovern's Liberty Inn. His beautiful voice drew customers, and while he entertained them with Irish ballads, his friends would case the joint, figuring out which drunk patrons had fat wallets worth lifting. After closing time, they'd wait in the alleys outside and rob the customers who'd been foolish enough to drink too much. It was a perfect system. O'Banion provided the entertainment, the victims provided themselves. But everything changed on January 17, 1920. The 18th Amendment went into effect, and alcohol became illegal across the United States. The era known as Prohibition had begun, and it would transform Chicago and Dean O'Banion forever. Most Americans thought Prohibition would fail. They were right, but not in the way they imagined. People didn't stop drinking. They just started getting their alcohol from criminals instead of legitimate businesses. Overnight, bootlegging became the most lucrative illegal enterprise in American history. Breweries, distilleries, smuggling operations, speakeasies, they all needed organization, protection, and muscle. They needed people who understood how to move product, bribe officials, and eliminate competition. They needed men like Dean O'Banion. O'Banion moved fast. Through his old mentor Samuel Nails Morton, a Jewish gangster who'd served in World War I and came home a decorated soldier, O'Banion made connections with suppliers in Canada. Canadian whiskey and beer could be smuggled across the border by boat across the Great Lakes, by truck through Detroit, or by rail if you bribed the right railroad workers. O'Banion set up distribution networks, established relationships with breweries that would secretly produce real beer instead of the weak, near beer they were legally allowed to make, and began building what would become a bootlegging empire. On December 19, 1921, O'Banion organized Chicago's first liquor hijacking. Think about that for a moment, the first. He and his men ambushed a shipment belonging to a rival gang, stealing thousands of dollars worth of whiskey. They didn't ask permission, they didn't negotiate, they just took it, and they got away with it. The hijacking sent a message to every other gang in Chicago. The North Siders were players now, and they weren't asking for scraps. But O'Banion wasn't stupid. He knew that pure violence would only get you so far. You needed a legitimate cover, something to explain your wealth and give you a base of operations that the police couldn't easily raid. In 1921, the same year he organized that first hijacking, O'Banion bought a half-interest in Schofield's flower shop at 738 North State Street. The location was perfect, directly across from Holy Name Cathedral, where he'd once sung in the choir. William Schofield, the other owner, was a legitimate florist who had no idea what he was getting into. O'Banion genuinely loved flowers. He had a gift for arrangements, a real artistic talent. He would spend hours in the shop, creating elaborate displays for weddings and funerals, losing himself in the work. It was probably the only truly peaceful time in his chaotic life, but the flower shop was more than just a hobby. The rooms above the shop became the headquarters for the North Side Gang. This was where deals were made, where strategy was planned, where money was counted. And because the shop specialized in funeral arrangements, O'Banion had a perfect excuse to associate with criminals. In Chicago, gangster funerals were elaborate affairs, and Schofield's became the florist of choice for the underworld. Every major criminal in the city came through those doors at one time or another, and O'Banion could conduct business while clipping roses. On February 5, 1921, just before he bought the flower shop, O'Banion married Viola Caniff. She was only 18 years old, a pretty girl from a respectable family who probably had no idea what she was getting into. They were married at Holy Name Cathedral, of course they were, and moved into an expensive apartment at 3600 North Pine Grove Avenue, one of Chicago's better neighborhoods. By all accounts, O'Banion was a devoted husband. He never left home without telling Viola where he was going. He brought her flowers regularly. He seemed, in his personal life at least, to be trying to maintain some connection to normalcy. But there was nothing normal about what Dean O'Banion was building. By 1922, the North Side Gang controlled bootlegging operations across the entire north side of Chicago and into the wealthy Gold Coast neighborhood along Lake Michigan. They supplied speakeasies, restaurants, and private clubs with illegal alcohol. The money came in so fast they could barely count it. O'Banion's personal fortune was estimated in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions in today's money, and it was growing every month. According to the Chicago Tribune, O'Banion's name appeared regularly in investigations into bootlegging, gambling, and other major crimes between 1921 and 1924. He was becoming famous or infamous depending on your perspective. The newspapers loved him because he made good copy, a choir boy turned bootlegger, a gangster who arranged flowers, a killer with a beautiful singing voice. They called him Dean O'Banion in the papers, though he never used that name himself. Dean was enough, but success in Chicago's underworld came with a price, and that price was paid in blood and politics. The city wasn't big enough for all the different gangs fighting for control of the bootlegging trade. On the south side, an Italian gang led by a man named Johnny Torrio was building its own empire. Torrio was older than O'Banion, more experienced and more thoughtful. He brought in a young, ambitious lieutenant from New York named Alphonse Capone, Al to his friends, though the newspapers would later call him Scarface because of the knife wounds on his face from a bar fight years before. Torrio understood something that many of the other gang leaders didn't. Constant warfare was bad for business. Dead gangsters couldn't pay protection money. Constant police raids because of gang violence disrupted operations. Killing each other was stupid when there was enough money for everyone. So in 1920, shortly after Prohibition began, Torrio called a meeting of all the major bootleggers in Chicago. The meeting was revolutionary. Torrio proposed dividing the city into territories. Each gang would control its own area and leave the others alone. They would pool their political influence, bribe officials together, and share intelligence about police raids. Most importantly, they wouldn't kill each other. There would be no turf wars, no hijackings, no unnecessary violence. They would all get rich together. For a while, it actually worked. O'Banion controlled the north side and the Gold Coast. Torrio and Capone controlled the south side. The Jenna brothers, 6 Sicilian siblings who ran alcohol operations out of Little Italy, controlled the near west side. Other gangs controlled other territories. They even jointly owned a casino called The Ship, where they met to divide profits and settle disputes. It was as close to peace as Chicago's underworld had ever seen. But peace in the criminal world is always temporary, and Dean O'Banion was about to make a decision that would destroy everything. The Jenna brothers were a problem. They produced industrial alcohol in hundreds of small stills scattered across Little Italy, using immigrant families who needed the money. The alcohol was poisonous. It could blind you or kill you if you drank enough, but the Jennas cut costs by selling it cheap. Some of it was redistilled into safer whiskey, but much of it went straight into speakeasies where desperate people drank it anyway. O'Banion despised the Jennas for several reasons. First, their cheap rot-gut alcohol was undercutting his business. Why pay O'Banion's prices for quality Canadian whiskey when you could buy the Jennas' poison for half the cost? Second, the Jennas were expanding their territory, pushing into areas that O'Banion considered his. They were violating the agreement Torrio had brokered, and Torrio wasn't doing anything about it. And third, O'Banion held deep prejudices against Italians in general and Sicilians in particular. He made jokes about them, insulted them to their faces, and made it clear he thought they were beneath him. This was dangerous. In Chicago's underworld, respect mattered more than money. You could steal from a man and he might forgive you, but insult him, especially in front of others, and you'd made an enemy for life. O'Banion was making a lot of enemies. The situation came to a head in November 1924 over a gambling debt. Angelo Genna had been gambling heavily at the Ship, the casino jointly owned by the various gangs. He'd lost badly and owed a marker, essentially an IOU, for a substantial sum. In the gangster world, these debts were usually forgiven as a professional courtesy. You win some, you lose some, but you don't squeeze your partners too hard over gambling losses. On November 3, O'Banion was sitting in on a meeting with Al Capone, Frank Nitti, Frank Rio, and others to tally the week's profits from the Ship. When Angelo Genna's debt came up, Capone suggested they cancel the marker. It was the diplomatic thing to do, the smart move to keep peace in the alliance. O'Banion refused. He demanded that Angelo Genna pay every penny he owed. Then he picked up the phone and called Angelo directly. The conversation quickly became heated. O'Banion, never one to hold his tongue, apparently said things that went far beyond a simple collection call. He insulted Angelo, insulted the Genna family, and made it clear he had no respect for their organization. When O'Banion hung up the phone, the other men in the room knew something had shifted. You didn't talk to the Gennas like that and walk away. The Sicilian brothers had a reputation for vengeance, and they had powerful friends. But O'Banion seemed unconcerned. He'd been in tight spots before and always came out on top. Why should this time be any different? What O'Banion didn't know, or maybe he did know but didn't care, was that he'd already committed a far worse betrayal, one that even his considerable charm couldn't fix. 6 months earlier, in May 1924, O'Banion had executed what might be called the greatest double-cross in Chicago gangster history. He owned a substantial stake in the Sebin Brewery on North Larrabee Street, a large operation that produced real beer despite prohibition. Johnny Torrio also owned a piece of the brewery, and both men were making good money from it. Then O'Banion learned through his sources in the police department that the brewery was going to be raided. The exact date, the exact time, he knew it all, but instead of warning Torrio and moving the operation, O'Banion saw an opportunity. He went to Torrio and told him a story. He was tired, O'Banion said. The gangster life was wearing him down. The violence, the constant police pressure, the conflicts with the Gennas, it was all too much. He wanted out. He wanted to sell his share of the Sebin Brewery and leave the rackets entirely. Would Torrio be interested in buying him out? Torrio was surprised but pleased. Removing O'Banion from the picture would solve a lot of problems. He was too unpredictable, too willing to cause trouble over minor insults, too difficult to control. If he wanted out, excellent. Torrio agreed to buy O'Banion's share for $500,000, about $7 million in today's money. On May 19, 1924, the deal was finalized. O'Banion received his money. That night, the last night O'Banion officially owned any part of the brewery, he and Torrio were both at the Sebin Brewery when the police raided it. O'Banion had no previous arrests for prohibition violations. He was released quickly with minimal charges, but Torrio had a record. He had to post bail for himself and 6 of his men. He faced serious charges and the possibility of jail time. And he'd just paid $500,000 for a brewery that was now closed and useless. It didn't take long for Torrio to realize what had happened. O'Banion had known about the raid. He'd timed the sale perfectly to dump the problem on Torrio right before disaster struck. He'd taken Torrio's money and walked away clean, leaving Torrio holding the bag, and O'Banion refused to return even a penny of the payment. This wasn't just bad business. This was the kind of insult that could never be forgiven. Torrio had tried to keep peace in Chicago, had created a system that made everyone rich, and O'Banion had thanked him by stealing $500,000 and making him look like a fool. Torrio was a patient man, but his patience had limits. He'd already been dealing with pressure from the Genna brothers, who had been demanding permission to kill O'Banion for months. Torrio had always refused, knowing that killing O'Banion would restart the gang wars. But now, after the Sebin Brewery betrayal, after O'Banion's insulting phone call to Angelo Genna, after years of dealing with O'Banion's arrogance and unpredictability, Torrio changed his mind. There was one last piece that had to fall into place before O'Banion could be eliminated. Mike Merlo, the president of the Unione Siciliana, a powerful Italian fraternal organization with deep connections to organized crime, had always protected O'Banion. Merlo believed in the peace that Torrio had created, and he refused to give his blessing to any hit on the North Side leader. On November 8, 1924, Mike Merlo died of cancer. With Merlo gone, the last obstacle to killing O'Banion disappeared. Torrio and the Genna brothers didn't even need to discuss it. The decision had already been made. The funeral for Mike Merlo was going to be massive. Everyone in Chicago's Italian community would attend, along with representatives from every gang in the city. Flowers would be needed, lots of flowers. Schofield's flower shop would be working overtime to fill all the orders. Over the next few days, a man from New York visited the shop several times. His name was Frankie Yale, and he was ostensibly there to order flowers for the Merlot funeral and discuss arrangements. But his real purpose was to memorize the layout of the shop, to figure out the best way to kill Dean O'Banion. On the morning of November 10, 1924, 2 days after Mike Merlot's death, O'Banion was in the back room of Schofield's, working on a large order of chrysanthemums. He was tired but focused, trying to get ahead of the backlog of orders for the Merlot funeral. His business partner, William Schofield, was out. One employee, William Crutchfield, was working in another part of the shop. Around 11:30 in the morning, the bell above the front door rang. 3 men entered. One of them was Frankie Yale. The other 2 were John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, Sicilian gunmen who'd already earned reputations as the most efficient killers in the Chicago underworld. O'Banion came out from the back room, his hands still carrying the clippers he'd been using. He smiled when he saw the men. "Hello, boys," he said, assuming they were there for the Merlot flowers. "You here for Merlot's flowers?" He extended his hand to Frankie Yale for a handshake. It was a natural gesture, the kind of friendly greeting O'Banion had performed thousands of times. Yale grabbed O'Banion's hand in a tight grip, so tight that O'Banion couldn't pull away. That's when Scalise and Anselmi pulled their pistols. The first 2 bullets hit O'Banion in the chest, the next 2 ripped through his throat. As he fell against a glass display case and slid to the floor, one of the killers fired a final shot into the back of his head. The coup de grace, the kiss of death. O'Banion's face, which had charmed so many people, which had smiled from choir stalls and flower shops, was blown apart. The entire killing took less than 10 seconds. By the time William Crutchfield heard the shots and came running, the 3 men were already walking calmly out the front door. They climbed into a dark blue Jewett automobile driven by Mike Jenna and drove away down State Street, turning onto Dearborn and disappearing into Chicago traffic. Dean O'Banion, the choir boy from Maroa, the singing waiter, the flower-arranging gangster, was dead at 32 years old. His body lay in a spreading pool of blood, surrounded by the chrysanthemums he'd been arranging. The shop he'd loved, the legitimate face he'd maintained, had become the scene of his execution. William Crutchfield, the only witness, gave police a description of the 3 men, but it wasn't enough, or maybe it was too much. Everyone in Chicago's underworld knew who'd killed O'Banion. The whole thing had Torrio and the Jennas written all over it, but knowing and proving were 2 different things. No one was charged, no one was arrested. Frankie Yale returned to New York. Scalise and Anselmi went back to their regular business. The police asked questions, collected evidence, and ultimately did nothing. The Catholic Church, aware of O'Banion's criminal activities, denied him burial in consecrated ground. His widow, Viola, was devastated. She'd known her husband was involved in illegal activities. Everyone in Chicago knew that, but she believed he was trying to go legitimate, that the flower shop represented a real change. Now she understood the truth. Dean O'Banion had never intended to go straight. The flower shop had been just another front, another tool in his criminal empire. The funeral for Dean O'Banion was one of the most elaborate Chicago had ever seen. Viola spared no expense. The casket was silver and bronze, lined with white satin, and cost $10,000, more than most people earned in several years. It was displayed at the Esbarbaro Funeral Home on North Wells Street, where thousands of people lined up to view the body. O'Banion looked peaceful in death, the damage to his face carefully reconstructed by the undertakers. He wore an expensive suit, and his hands, which had pulled so many triggers and arranged so many flowers, were folded peacefully over his chest. A rosary was entwined in his fingers, the devoted Catholic killer, even in death maintaining the contradictions that had defined his life. 26 trucks were needed to transport all the flowers sent to the funeral. Some estimates put the total cost at $100,000. Every gangster in Chicago attended, including Al Capone, who sent an enormous arrangement and came personally to pay his respects. The funeral procession stretched for blocks. Mounted police had to clear the streets. An estimated 15,000 people witnessed the spectacle, but among the mourners were several men who weren't there to grieve. They were there to plan revenge. Earl Jaime Weiss, O'Banion's best friend and closest lieutenant, sobbed uncontrollably when he heard the news. He collapsed in his bathroom, overcome with grief and rage. Louis Two-Gun Alteri made wild statements about having a shootout in the street with O'Banion's killers right then and there. Vincent Drucci and George "Bugs" Morin, the other core members of the North Side Gang, were quieter. but their silence was more dangerous. Dino Banyan was dead, but the North Side gang was very much alive, and they had no intention of letting this murder go unanswered. Johnny Torrio probably thought he'd solved his O'Banion problem. The North Side operation would fall apart without its charismatic leader. The territory would be divided among the remaining gangs. Business would continue, perhaps even more smoothly now that the most unpredictable element had been removed. He was catastrophically wrong. What Torrio had actually done was light a fuse that would burn for 5 years, consuming hundreds of lives and transforming Chicago into the most violent city in America. The beer wars, as they would come to be known, had begun, and before they ended, the streets of Chicago would run red with blood. The national reputation of organized crime would be forever changed, and men who thought they were untouchable would learn that in Chicago's underworld, no one was safe. The funeral was over. Dino Banyan had been laid to rest with more ceremony than most kings. But as the mourners dispersed and returned to their lives, 4 men remained who had no intention of moving on. Jaime Weiss, George Morin, Vincent Drucci, and Louis Alteri stood together in the cold November air, and in their silence was a promise. O'Banion's death would not go unanswered. Earl Wojciechowski, everyone called him Jaime Weiss, had known Dino Banyan since they were boys running the streets of Little Hell together. They'd stolen together, fought together, built an empire together. When Weiss heard that O'Banion had been killed, he collapsed in his bathroom, sobbing uncontrollably. His grief was real and raw, but grief in the Chicago underworld didn't mean weakness, it meant rage. And Jaime Weiss's rage was going to reshape the city. Weiss was different from O'Banion in important ways. Where O'Banion had been charming and charismatic, able to talk his way through almost any situation, Weiss was cold and calculating. He had a violent temper that could erupt without warning, and he held grudges like other men held their breath. His own brother Fred would later tell police that the only time he'd seen Jaime in 20 years was when Jaime shot him back in 1920. That was the kind of man now leading the North Side gang. Like O'Banion, Weiss was a devout Catholic. He attended Mass regularly and always carried a rosary in his pocket. The contradiction, a man who could order murders without hesitation while clutching prayer beads, seemed not to trouble him. Perhaps he believed God would understand, or perhaps, in the world he inhabited, religion and violence weren't contradictions at all. They were just 2 ways of dealing with the chaos of existence. Weiss immediately took control of the North Side gang, with Bugs Morin and Vincent Drucci as his top lieutenants. Their first priority was obvious: revenge. They knew who'd ordered O'Banion's death. Everyone knew. Johnny Torrio and the Jenna brothers had killed their friend, and according to the code that governed Chicago's underworld, that demanded an answer. Blood for blood, life for life. But Weiss was smart. He understood that going after all his enemies at once would be suicide. He needed to be strategic, to pick his targets carefully, and he needed to send a message that would echo through every speakeasy and gambling den in Chicago. You don't touch the North Side gang without paying a price. In January 1925, just 2 months after O'Banion's murder, the North Siders made their first move. They spotted Al Capone's car on the South Side and opened fire. Capone wasn't hit, but the message was clear. The war was on and nobody was safe. 12 days later, on January 24, 1925, Jaime Weiss and Bugs Morin were driving through the South Side when they spotted Johnny Torrio's chauffeured Lincoln pulling up to 7011 Clyde Avenue, a nice neighborhood not far from the South Shore Country Club. This was Torrio's home. He and his wife Anna had been out shopping, and Torrio was gathering packages from the car when a gray Cadillac pulled up behind him. Weiss and Morin stepped out, armed with a shotgun and a handgun. They didn't say a word, they just started shooting. The first blast hit Torrio in the jaw, the next caught him in the groin, then his legs, his abdomen. Torrio fell to the sidewalk, his blood spreading across the concrete while his wife screamed. His chauffeur, hit in the knee, managed to drive away, the Lincoln riddled with bullet holes. Jaime Weiss walked over to the fallen man. Torrio was still alive, still conscious, looking up at his executioner. Weiss pointed his gun at Torrio's head. This was it, the final bullet, the one that would avenge Dino Banyan and end Johnny Torrio forever. He pulled the trigger. The gun jammed. Weiss pulled the trigger again, still nothing. In those few seconds of fumbling with a malfunctioning weapon, Bugs Morin kicked Torrio in the stomach repeatedly while clubbing him with a billy club. But they could hear sirens now, police responding to the shots. The 2 gunmen looked at each other and made a decision. They ran back to their car and drove away, leaving Johnny Torrio bleeding on his doorstep while his wife cradled his shattered body. Torrio survived, barely. He was rushed to Jackson Park Hospital, where surgeons worked for hours to save his life. He'd been hit 5 times and the damage was catastrophic. While the doctors operated, Torrio kept moaning, "Cauterize it. Cauterize it," begging them to burn his wounds closed because he knew the gangster practice of boiling bullets in poison before shooting their victims. He was terrified of infection from contaminated ammunition. The man who'd organized Chicago's criminal empire was reduced to a frightened patient, begging doctors to save him from the very methods he'd helped perfect. While Torrio recovered, he took extraordinary precautions. He stationed 2 of his own gunmen outside his hospital room and 2 more outside the building. Police officers also stood guard. The wounded crime boss understood that the North Siders wouldn't stop trying until he was dead. He'd ordered the hit on O'Banion, and now the debt had to be paid. The only question was whether it would be paid in his blood or someone else's, but something had changed in Johnny Torrio. The man who'd been Chicago's most powerful criminal, who'd created the system that made everyone rich, who'd survived 2 decades in the underworld without a scratch, had finally been broken. Not by bullets exactly, but by the realization of what those bullets meant. The peace he'd worked so hard to build was gone. The rules he'd tried to establish didn't matter anymore. Chicago was descending into chaos, and Torrio wanted no part of it. When he was well enough to leave the hospital, Torrio had to serve his 9-month sentence for the Sebin Brewery raid, the one O'Banion had set him up for. He went to Lake County Jail in Waukegan under heavy guard, and while he sat in that cell, he made a decision that would change everything. When Johnny Torrio walked out of jail in late 1925, he called a meeting with Al Capone. What he said has become legend in Chicago's criminal history. "It's all yours, Al. Me. I'm quitting. It's Europe for me." Just like that, Johnny Torrio was done. He'd built an empire worth $70 million a year, close to $1 billion in today's money, and he was walking away from it. He moved to Italy with his wife and mother, leaving behind the blood and violence of Chicago. He tried to create order and chaos, to make the criminal underworld run like a business. But men like Dean O'Banion and Jaime Weiss didn't want order. They wanted respect, revenge, territory, power, and they were willing to die for it. Al Capone, just 26 years old, suddenly found himself in control of the largest criminal organization in Chicago. The young man from Brooklyn who'd arrived in the city just a few years earlier was now responsible for an empire that included illegal breweries, speakeasies, gambling houses, and a transportation network that reached into Canada. He also inherited Johnny Torrio's problems, including a war with the North Side gang that showed no signs of stopping. Capone was different from Torrio. Where Torrio had been thoughtful and strategic, preferring negotiation to violence, Capone was flamboyant and ruthless. He wore expensive suits that cost $5,000 each. He bought custom fedoras. He wanted everyone to know who he was and what he represented. And what he represented was power, raw, undeniable, violent power. But Capone understood one thing very clearly. He had to deal with the North Siders, and that meant dealing with Jaime Weiss. Weiss, however, wasn't interested in peace. With Torrio gone, he turned his attention to the other men responsible for O'Banion's death. The Jenna brothers, these 6 Sicilian siblings, had controlled Little Italy, flooding the neighborhood with their poisonous industrial alcohol. They'd been pushing into North Side territory for years, and Angelo Jenna had been part of the plot to kill O'Banion. Now it was their turn to pay. On May 26, 1925, Angelo Jenna was driving through Chicago when 3 cars filled with North Side gunmen spotted him. What followed was a high-speed chase through the city streets, with bullets flying from moving vehicles. Angelo tried to escape, pushing his car faster and faster, but the North Siders were relentless. Finally, his car crashed into a lamp post at Hudson and Ogden Avenues. The North Side gunmen, Jaime Weiss, Bugs Morin, and Vincent Drucci, approached the wrecked vehicle. Angelo Jenna was still alive, bleeding and broken but conscious. They shot him repeatedly, making sure the job was done. Then they drove away. Angelo was rushed to Evangelical Deaconess Hospital, where his brother Sam, his wife, and his brother-in-law waited by his bedside. When police asked Angelo who shot him, he just shrugged. Even dying, he followed the code: you don't rat to the police. Angelo Jenna died shortly afterward, the first of the brothers to fall. The North Siders weren't finished. Less than 3 weeks later, on June 13, 1925, Mike Jenna found himself in a car with 2 men he thought were his allies. Albert Anselmi and John Scalise, the same gunmen who'd helped kill Dean O'Banion. What Mike didn't know was that Anselmi and Scalise had secretly switched their loyalty to Al Capone. They were taking Mike for a ride, gangster slang for a one-way trip to death, but something went wrong. Police spotted the car and tried to pull it over. A gunfight erupted. Mike Jenna was shot and wounded, unable to move. Anselmi and Scalise abandoned him and ran. Mike died 2 hours later. 2 police officers also died in the shootout, adding to the mounting body count of Chicago's beer wars. Tony Jenna, the third brother and the one known as the Gentleman because he'd been a legitimate architect before joining the family business, went into hiding. He knew he was next, but on July 8, 1925, a friend, Antonio Spano, someone Tony trusted, asked him to meet at Grand Avenue and Curtis Street. Tony agreed, not knowing it was a trap set up by Vincent Drucci and Bugs Morin. When Tony Jenna arrived and shook hands with Spano, 2 men stepped out from behind his supposed friend and shot him in the chest and abdomen. It was designed to mirror O'Banion's death, killed while extending his hand in greeting. Tony was rushed to the hospital, and before he died, he told his brother Sam that it was Spano who'd set him up, another Jenna brother dead. In less than 2 months, 3 of the 6 Jenna brothers had been killed. The remaining 3, Peter, Jim, and Sam, looked at the carnage around them and made a decision. They fled Chicago, eventually returning to Sicily. The Jenna crime family, which had once been one of the most powerful organizations in the city, was effectively destroyed. Al Capone absorbed what was left of their operations into his own empire. The North Side Gang had systematically dismantled one of their major enemies, but the violence was taking a toll on everyone. By mid-1925, Chicago was experiencing gang-related killings at a rate that shocked even hardened observers. Over 100 men had died in the beer wars, and there was no end in sight. Jaime Weiss wasn't satisfied. Yes, 3 Jenna brothers were dead and 3 more had fled. Yes, Johnny Torrio had left the city in fear. But Al Capone was still there, still controlling the South Side, still profiting from the empire built on O'Banion's betrayal and murder. Weiss wanted Capone dead. He wanted it with an intensity that bordered on obsession. On September 20, 1926, Weiss led what would become one of the most audacious attacks in Chicago gangland history. Capone had his headquarters at the Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero, a suburb completely controlled by the Chicago outfit. The building had steel-shuttered windows for protection. Capone thought he was safe there. Weiss proved him wrong. A caravan of cars filled with North Side gunmen drove past the Hawthorne Hotel in broad daylight, machine guns blazing. They fired over 1,000 rounds at the building, shattering windows, chipping walls, sending guests and staff diving for cover. The attack lasted only a few minutes but felt like an eternity. When the smoke cleared miraculously, no one had been killed, though several people were wounded. Al Capone had been in the hotel during the attack. His bodyguard, Frank Rio, had tackled him to the floor the moment the shooting started, probably saving his life. When Capone got up and saw the destruction, his supposedly impregnable headquarters torn apart by machine gun fire, he understood something important. Jaime Weiss was never going to stop. As long as Weiss was alive, Capone would never be safe. There's a legend that Jaime Weiss was the only gangster Al Capone truly feared. Whether that's true or not, Capone certainly respected Weiss's capacity for violence and his unwillingness to compromise. Weiss didn't want money or territory or power-sharing agreements. He wanted revenge, pure and simple, and he would pursue it until either Capone was dead or Weiss himself was killed. Capone decided to solve the problem permanently. October 11, 1926, was a Monday. Jaime Weiss had spent the day at a courthouse watching jury selection for the murder trial of Joe Salties, a South Side gangster who'd allied with the North Siders. Weiss carried in his pocket a list of prospective jurors. He was planning to tamper with the jury to ensure Salties would be acquitted. It was the kind of practical detail that kept the criminal empire running. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Weiss left the courthouse with 4 companions. Patrick Murray, a fellow gangster, W. O'Brien, a lawyer who specialized in defending criminals, Benjamin Jacobs, O'Brien's investigator, and Sam Peller, Weiss's chauffeur. They drove to 740 North State Street, the old Schofield's flower shop, directly across from Holy Name Cathedral, where Dean O'Banion had once arranged flowers and where he'd been murdered almost exactly 2 years earlier. The building now served as the North Side Gang's headquarters. Weiss kept his offices on the upper floors. As the 5 men parked their car and began walking across State Street toward the entrance, they had no idea that 2 gunmen were waiting for them in a second-floor room at 740 North State Street. the building right next door to the flower shop. The gunmen had rented the room days earlier. They'd had a perfect view of the street below, watching, waiting for the right moment. One of them was armed with a Thompson submachine gun, the Tommy gun that would become synonymous with Chicago gangsters. The other had a shotgun. When Weiss and his men were in the middle of the street, the gunmen opened fire. The sound was deafening. Machine gun bullets and shotgun blasts poured down on the 5 men from above. Jaime Weiss was hit multiple times. 10 bullets tore through his body. Patrick Murray fell dead almost instantly. The other 3 men scattered, wounded but alive, desperately seeking cover. Weiss fell to the ground in the middle of State Street. Sam Peller, in a panic, accidentally shot Weiss again as he fell. Some of the bullets from the fusillade struck the cornerstone of Holy Name Cathedral across the street, chipping away at the stone inscription that read, "At the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth." The words were partly destroyed by gunfire, leaving behind a permanent scar on the church. By the time police arrived, Jaime Weiss was dead. He was 28 years old. He'd led the North Side Gang for less than 2 years, but in that time, he'd waged a war so violent that it made headlines across the country. He'd avenged Dean O'Banion's death multiple times over, killing Jenna Brothers and nearly killing Johnny Torrio and Al Capone. But in the end, he'd met the same fate as O'Banion, gunned down near the flower shop where it all began. When police searched Weiss's body, they found the rosary he always carried. They also found over $5,000 in cash, walking around money for a successful bootlegger. And they found that list of jurors for the Joe Salty's trial, evidence of the corruption that permeated every level of Chicago's criminal justice system. Weiss's killers were never officially identified or arrested. But everyone knew who'd ordered the hit. The gunmen were believed to be working for Al Capone, possibly including a shooter named Jack McGurn, who would later earn the nickname Machine Gun Jack McGurn from this very assassination. Some said Frank Nitti had organized the operation, but regardless of who pulled the trigger, the order had come from Capone. It was revenge for the attack on the Hawthorne Hotel, payment for the attempted murder of Johnny Torrio, settlement for years of warfare that had cost dozens of lives. Jaime Weiss was buried at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, in a family mausoleum. It was the same cemetery where Dean O'Banion had been laid to rest. The 2 friends who'd grown up together in Little Hell, who'd built the North Side Gang together, who'd fought and killed side by side, now rested near each other in death. With Weiss dead, leadership of the North Side Gang passed briefly to Vincent Drucci and then to George "Bugs" Morin, but the gang had been badly weakened. O'Banion was dead, Weiss was dead. 3 Jenna brothers were dead and 3 more had fled. Johnny Torrio had left Chicago entirely. The North Siders were running out of leaders and running out of time. 10 days after Weiss's death, on October 21, 1926, a peace conference was held at the Hotel Sherman in downtown Chicago. Representatives from all the major gangs attended, including Al Capone and Bugs Morin. They negotiated a truce. Territories were divided, rules were established, everyone agreed to stop the killing. The peace lasted about as long as these things usually did in Chicago, which is to say, not very long at all. Bugs Morin had agreed to the truce, but he hadn't forgiven anything. He was still angry about O'Banion. He was still angry about Weiss, and he was still running bootlegging operations on the North Side, still competing with Capone for territory and profits. Al Capone, meanwhile, had solidified his control over Chicago's underworld. With Torrio gone, the Jennas destroyed, and Weiss dead, Capone was the undisputed king of Chicago organized crime. His organization was pulling in over $100 million a year from bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution. He was famous or infamous, not just in Chicago but across the entire country. Newspapers wrote about him constantly. The public was fascinated by this young gangster who wore expensive suits and seemed to live above the law. But Capone had a problem. Bugs Morin was still out there. The North Side Gang was diminished but not destroyed, and as long as they existed, Capone couldn't completely control Chicago. Morin was hijacking Capone's liquor shipments, undercutting his prices, generally making himself a nuisance. It wasn't the full-scale war that Jaime Weiss had waged, but it was enough to be annoying, and Al Capone didn't like being annoyed. By 1929, Capone had decided that the problem needed to be solved once and for all. The peace conference hadn't worked. Individual assassinations hadn't worked. What he needed was something bigger, something that would send an unmistakable message not just to Bugs Morin but to every gangster in Chicago. He needed an event so shocking, so brutal, that no one would ever challenge the Chicago outfit again. He began planning what would become the most infamous massacre in American criminal history. The war that had begun with Dean O'Banion's greed, his betrayal of Johnny Torrio at the Sebin Brewery, his insulting phone call to Angelo Jenna, his arrogant belief that he could cheat his partners without consequences, was about to reach its bloody climax. O'Banion's death had triggered Jaime Weiss's revenge campaign. Weiss's campaign had destroyed the Jenna brothers and driven Johnny Torrio from Chicago. Weiss's death had elevated Al Capone to unchallenged supremacy. And Capone's supremacy now demanded the final elimination of the North Side Gang. It had been over 4 years since O'Banion died in his flower shop. 4 years of murder after murder, ambush after ambush, revenge killings and counter-revenge killings. Hundreds of men were dead, families were destroyed. The streets of Chicago ran red with blood, and for what? Territory, money, respect, pride. Dean O'Banion had wanted to cheat his partners out of $500,000. That decision, made in the spring of 1924, had set in motion a cascade of violence that reshaped Chicago's underworld, and it wasn't over yet. The final act was still to come. On the north side, in a garage at 2122 North Clark Street, Bugs Morin ran his operations. It was February 1929, and winter had Chicago in its grip. The temperature was below zero, and snow covered the streets. Inside the garage, Morin's men gathered to conduct business, to count money, to plan their next moves against Capone. They had no idea that Al Capone had already made his next move, and it would be his last move. The North Side Gang wouldn't survive what was coming. The stage was set for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. February 14, 1929, Valentine's Day, a day meant for love and romance, for chocolates and flowers, for expressions of devotion. In Chicago, it would become synonymous with something else entirely. The temperature had dropped below zero, snow covered the streets. It was the kind of brutal winter morning where the cold cuts through your coat and makes your bones ache. At 2122 North Clark Street, in the Lincoln Park neighborhood on Chicago's north side, a brick garage served as headquarters for what remained of the North Side Gang. Inside the SMC Cartage Company garage, 7 men waited. Some accounts say they were expecting a shipment of hijacked whiskey from Detroit's Purple Gang, quality Canadian liquor that they could sell for a handsome profit. Other historians dispute this, pointing out that the men gathered there were Bugs Morin's most trusted lieutenants, all wearing expensive suits, hardly the kind of outfit you'd wear to unload trucks in a freezing garage. The truth, according to some of Morin's relatives, was simpler and more desperate. They were there to meet with Bugs Morin himself. The North Side Gang was losing territory to Al Capone, and they needed to discuss strategy. But Morin was running late that morning. He'd overslept. The 7 men in the garage were a mix of gangsters and hangers-on. Peter Gusenberg, 41, and his younger brother Frank, 37, were top enforcers for the gang, tough, experienced killers who'd survived years of gang warfare. Albert Kashelek, who went by the name James Clark and was Morin's brother-in-law, was another veteran enforcer. Adam Hayer served as Morin's business manager, handling the financial side of bootlegging operations. Albert Weinschenk managed various legitimate businesses that served as fronts for illegal activities. Johnny May was a mechanic who fixed the gang's cars and had no criminal record. He was just a working man trying to make a living. And then there was Reinhard Schwimmer, an optician who hung around with gangsters because he found them exciting. He wasn't a criminal. He just liked the thrill of being close to dangerous men. They stood around the garage, talking, smoking, waiting. Johnny May's German Shepherd Highball was tied to one of the car bumpers. The dog didn't like the cold any more than the men did. Around 10:30 in the morning, a car pulled up outside the garage. It looked like a police squad car, dark blue, with the right markings. 4 men got out. 2 of them wore Chicago police uniforms. The other 2 wore long coats and civilian clothes. To anyone watching from across the street, it looked like a routine police raid, the kind that happened all the time during Prohibition. The 4 men walked into the garage. The 7 men inside weren't particularly worried. Police raids were just part of doing business. You paid a fine, maybe spent a night in jail, and then you were back on the street. Morin and his gang had been through this routine dozens of times before. The men in uniform ordered the 7 to line up against the north wall of the garage, facing the whitewashed bricks. This was standard procedure for a police search. The 7 men complied, standing shoulder to shoulder, their backs to their supposed arresters. They had no reason to think this was anything other than another shakedown. Then the shooting started. 2 Thompson submachine guns and a shotgun opened fire simultaneously. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, a continuous roar of gunfire that seemed to go on forever but probably lasted less than a minute. 70 rounds of ammunition tore through the 7 men. The Thompson guns fired so fast that witnesses outside described it as sounding like a pneumatic drill or a jackhammer. The men against the wall had no chance. Bullets ripped through their backs, their necks, their heads. Peter Gusenberg was hit 14 times. His brother Frank took 22 bullets. The shotgun blasts were even more devastating. One victim had half his face blown off. The men collapsed against the wall, then slid to the floor in spreading pools of blood. Some died instantly. Others took longer, drowning in their own blood, their bodies so riddled with bullets that it was hard to tell where one wound ended and another began. When the shooting stopped, the 2 men in civilian clothes carefully placed their guns on the floor and raised their hands in the air. The 2 in police uniforms walked them out of the garage at gunpoint, making it look like an arrest had been made. It was a perfect piece of theater. Any witnesses watching would think the police had arrived, exchanged fire with gangsters, and were now taking survivors into custody. The 4 men got back into their fake police car and drove away calmly. No rushing, no panic, just 4 men finishing a job and going home. Inside the garage, Highball the dog began howling. The animal had witnessed the entire massacre and was now in a state of shock, his howls echoing through the building. That's what brought people running. Neighbors who'd heard the gunfire but assumed it was just another gang dispute now heard the desperate, anguished howling of a terrified animal. Police arrived to find a scene of unimaginable carnage. 6 men were clearly dead, their bodies torn apart by bullets. But Frank Gusenberg was still alive, barely breathing, blood pouring from 22 gunshot wounds. The police officers knelt beside him, begging him to identify his attackers. Frank Gusenberg, even dying, followed the code. When asked who shot him, he replied, "Nobody shot me." He died 3 hours later without saying another word. The police investigation began immediately, but they already knew they were facing an impossible task. No one had seen the killers' faces clearly. The fake police uniforms had been brilliant. Witnesses assumed it was a legitimate police raid and looked away. The only real witness was Highball the dog, and he couldn't testify. The animal never recovered from what he'd witnessed. He became aggressive and unpredictable, and police eventually had to put him down. Bugs Moran arrived at the garage shortly after the massacre, saw the police cars and the chaos, and immediately understood what had happened. When reporters asked him about it later, he was direct and furious. "Only Capone kills like that," he said. The statement was telling, not just because it accused Capone, but because of the way Moran phrased it. Kills like that. The massacre wasn't just murder. It was a statement, a display of power so overwhelming that it couldn't be mistaken for anything else. Al Capone was in Florida at his estate on Palm Island when the massacre occurred. He had a perfect alibi and offered his own opinion when reached by reporters. The only man who kills like that is Bugs Moran. It was a brilliant deflection, turning Moran's accusation back on him while maintaining complete deniability. The St. Valentine's Day massacre shocked America in a way that previous gang killings hadn't. This wasn't a shootout between armed gangsters. This wasn't even an ambush in the traditional sense. It was an execution, cold, calculated, and carried out with a level of sophistication that revealed just how powerful and organized Chicago's criminal enterprises had become. 7 men lined up and slaughtered like cattle. The image haunted the public imagination. Newspapers across the country ran the story on their front pages. The Chicago Tribune published crime scene photos that were horrifyingly graphic. Americans who'd viewed gangsters as almost romantic figures, rebels against an unpopular prohibition law, suddenly saw them for what they really were: murderers operating with impunity in America's second-largest city. The massacre had been intended to eliminate Bugs Moran and destroy the North Side Gang once and for all. In that respect, it failed. Moran survived because he'd overslept and arrived late. But in every other way, the massacre succeeded beyond Capone's wildest expectations. The North Side Gang was effectively finished. Moran continued operating for several more years, but he was a shadow of his former self, relegated to small-time operations while Capone controlled most of Chicago. The authorities knew Capone was behind it. Everyone knew, but knowing and proving were different things. No one was ever charged with the St. Valentine's Day massacre. The investigation dragged on for months and then years, but without witnesses willing to testify and without concrete evidence linking Capone to the crime, prosecutors had nothing. The massacre did have consequences, though just not the ones Capone expected. For years, he'd operated in Chicago with relative immunity. Police could be bribed, judges could be bought. Politicians were happy to look the other way as long as the money kept flowing. But the St. Valentine's Day massacre created a level of public outrage that made Capone toxic. President Herbert Hoover himself reportedly demanded that Capone be prosecuted. Federal authorities began looking for any way to bring him down. They found it in the most mundane of places, his tax returns. Or rather, his complete lack of tax returns. Al Capone's criminal empire was pulling in over $100 million a year, more than $1 billion in today's money, but Capone had never paid a penny in income taxes. He didn't maintain bank accounts in his own name. He didn't own property under his own name. He paid for everything in cash. He built his entire life around being invisible to the government. But the Internal Revenue Service had a special intelligence unit, the T-Men, who specialized in tracking money. Led by Agent Frank Wilson, they began the painstaking work of documenting Capone's spending. Custom-made suits at $5,000 each, cars, a mansion in Florida, jewelry, entertainment. Wilson added it all up, creating a picture of a man living far beyond any legitimate means of support. The turning point came when Wilson discovered receipts from a gambling operation linked to Capone. It wasn't much, just enough to establish a paper trail showing income that Capone had never reported. Combined with evidence of his extravagant lifestyle, it was enough. On June 5, 1931, Capone was indicted on 22 counts of federal income tax evasion, covering the years 1925 through 1929. He tried to negotiate a plea bargain, 2.5 years in prison in exchange for guilty pleas. He thought he had a deal worked out, but when he arrived in court, Judge James Wilkerson made it clear that he wasn't bound by any agreement between prosecutors and defense attorneys. The judge had the final say on sentencing, and he intended to make an example of Capone. Capone went to trial. His lawyers tried every trick they could think of. Capone even attempted to bribe the jury. But Judge Wilkerson, learning of the bribery attempt, switched the entire jury panel on the morning the trial began, bringing in jurors from another case that Capone's people hadn't had time to corrupt. On October 17, 1931, Al Capone was convicted on 5 counts of tax evasion. On November 24, he was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000, and ordered to pay over $200,000 in back taxes plus interest. At the time, it was the harshest sentence ever given for tax evasion. Capone initially went to the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta, where he tried to maintain his lifestyle through bribes, getting himself a private cell, special privileges, visitors whenever he wanted. When authorities discovered what was happening, they transferred him to Alcatraz, the maximum security prison on an island in San Francisco Bay that had just opened. There were no privileges at Alcatraz. No bribes, no special treatment, no running your criminal empire from a comfortable cell. Alcatraz broke Al Capone. He'd contracted syphilis years earlier, probably as a young man working in brothels. The disease had gone untreated, and now it was destroying his brain. By 1938, his mental and physical health had deteriorated so badly that he was hospitalized. He suffered from dementia, hallucinations, and partial paralysis. In 1939, after serving 7.5 years, he was released early due to his declining health. The most powerful gangster in America returned to his Florida estate a shell of his former self. His mind was gone, his body was failing. He spent his final years in isolation, cared for by his wife and son, haunted by imaginary enemies and unable to understand what had happened to him. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone died of cardiac arrest following a stroke. He was 48 years old. The war that had begun with Dean O'Banion's betrayal of Johnny Torrio in May 1924 was finally over. It had lasted 5 years, from O'Banion's murder in November 1924 to the St. Valentine's Day massacre in February 1929. But the consequences rippled out for years afterward, reshaping not just Chicago's underworld, but the entire relationship between organized crime and law enforcement in America. Let's do the math, the terrible arithmetic of greed and violence. Dean O'Banion dead at 32, Jaime Weiss dead at 28, Angelo Jenna, Mike Jenna, Tony Jenna all dead, the 7 victims of the St. Valentine's Day massacre, Johnny Torrio driven from Chicago in fear, Al Capone destroyed by disease and imprisonment, and those were just the famous names, the ones that made the newspapers. Historians estimate that between 1924 and 1929, over 400 men died in Chicago's gang wars, 400 sons and brothers and husbands. Some of them were criminals, yes, men who'd chosen violence and paid the price, but many were just working people caught in the crossfire, mechanics like Johnny May, opticians like Reinhard Schwimmer. Innocent people who happened to be in the wrong place when the shooting started. And for what? O'Banion wanted $500,000 and couldn't resist cheating Johnny Torrio out of it. That decision, made in a moment of greed and arrogance, set off a chain reaction that consumed hundreds of lives. Every murder demanded revenge. Every act of revenge triggered a counterattack. The cycle fed on itself, growing more vicious with each iteration, until the only way to end it was for one side to completely destroy the other. The beer wars changed America before the scent. Valentine's Day Massacre. The federal government had relatively little involvement in fighting organized crime. Local police handled local crime, even when that crime involved powerful criminal organizations operating across multiple cities. But the public outcry following the massacre, combined with the obvious corruption of local law enforcement in Chicago, forced the federal government to take action. The conviction of Al Capone on tax evasion charges established a precedent that would be used against gangsters for decades. If you couldn't prove murder or bootlegging or racketeering, you could follow the money. Everyone has to pay taxes on their income, even if that income comes from illegal sources. The IRS became one of law enforcement's most powerful weapons against organized crime. The massacre also marked the end of Prohibition's romantic era. For most of the 1920s, many Americans had viewed bootleggers as harmless rogues, providing a service that most people wanted despite the law. Speakeasies were glamorous, gangsters wore nice suits and threw parties. It all seemed exciting and a little bit dangerous, but fundamentally victimless. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre destroyed that illusion. 7 men executed. Blood covering a garage floor, a dog howling in trauma. There was nothing romantic about it, nothing glamorous. It was just brutal, senseless violence in service of profit and ego. Prohibition would be repealed in 1933, but the damage was already done. The criminal organizations built during Prohibition didn't disappear when alcohol became legal again. They just shifted to other enterprises: gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering, loan sharking. The structures that men like O'Banion and Torrio and Capone had built outlived them all, evolving into the sophisticated organized crime families that would dominate American cities for the next 50 years. Bugs Moran survived the massacre but never recovered his power. He spent the 1930s and 1940s running small-time operations, a far cry from the days when he'd controlled the entire North Side. In 1946, he was arrested for robbing a bank employee of a mere $10,000, pocket change compared to the millions he'd once controlled. He was convicted and sent to Leavenworth Federal Prison, where he died of lung cancer in 1957 at the age of 64. His last words to his lawyer were reportedly, "My only regret is that I never killed that son of a bitch Capone." Vincent Drucci, one of the original members of the North Side Gang, who'd survived so many assassination attempts and gang wars, died in 1927 in the back of a police car. He'd been arrested for some minor charge and started arguing with the police officer. The argument turned into a scuffle. Drucci went for the officer's gun. The officer shot him 4 times. After surviving years of gang warfare, Drucci was killed by a cop over nothing. Louis Altery, the North Sider who'd wanted to have a shootout in the street to avenge O'Banion, eventually moved to Colorado. But the past caught up with him. In 1935, he was gunned down outside his apartment in a hit ordered by the Chicago outfit. Old debts always got paid eventually. The flower shop where Dean O'Banion died continued operating for years after his death. William Schofield kept running the business, probably trying to forget that his partner had been executed in the back room. The building still stands today, though it's no longer a flower shop. Tourists sometimes stop by to take pictures, drawn by the dark history of the place, the garage where the St. Valentine's Day Massacre occurred was torn down in 1967. But before the demolition, a businessman named George Patey bought the bricks from the north wall, the wall where the 7 men had died. He tried various business ventures with them, including putting them in a nightclub restroom and selling them individually by mail. Eventually, 300 of those bricks ended up at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, where they're displayed with the bullet holes still visible, a grim monument to that February morning. And what about Viola O'Banion, Dean's young widow who'd believed her husband was going straight? She remarried a few years after his death and lived a quiet life, far from the violence that had consumed her first husband. She died in 1975, having outlived almost everyone involved in the beer wars. Looking back across nearly a century, it's hard not to feel the weight of all that wasted life. Dean O'Banion was a choir boy who became a killer, a talented florist who arranged funerals for men he'd helped murder. He could have been anything. He chose to be a gangster, and it killed him at 32. Jaime Weiss was brilliant and ruthless and loyal to his friend. He spent 2 years avenging O'Banion's death and died at 28, shot down across the street from the same cathedral where he'd once prayed as a boy. Al Capone became the most famous gangster in American history, but he died alone and insane, his mind destroyed by disease, mourned by almost no one. All of them made choices, all of them knew the risks. But knowing the risks and understanding the consequences are different things. When Dean O'Banion decided to cheat Johnny Torrio out of $500,000, he couldn't have known that his decision would lead to hundreds of deaths, would reshape American law enforcement, would become a cautionary tale told for generations. Or maybe he did know, maybe he knew exactly what would happen and did it anyway, because in the world he inhabited, respect and pride mattered more than survival. In Chicago's underworld during Prohibition, you couldn't let anyone disrespect you without responding. To show weakness was to invite your own destruction, so they kept killing each other, not because they wanted to, but because the code they lived by demanded it. The tragedy of the beer wars isn't just that so many people died. It's that they died for nothing. The territories they fought over, the bootlegging operations they killed to control, all of it disappeared when Prohibition ended. The money they made was spent or lost. The power they wielded vanished the moment they died. In the end, nothing they accomplished mattered. Nothing lasted except the blood they spilled and the families they destroyed. Today, when people think about Chicago in the 1920s, they think of Al Capone and the Scent. Valentine's Day Massacre. They think of gangsters in fedoras and pinstripe suits, Tommy guns and speakeasies, a romantic vision of a glamorous criminal underworld, but there was nothing romantic about it. It was just men killing each other over money and pride, leaving behind widows and orphans and broken bodies. Dean O'Banion arranged flowers and sang in choirs and murdered his enemies. He loved his wife and carried a rosary and cheated his partners. He was charming and violent, devout and ruthless, a living contradiction who couldn't reconcile the different parts of himself. When he died in his flower shop, surrounded by chrysanthemums, maybe he finally found peace. Or maybe he just found what everyone in that life eventually finds: darkness, silence, and an unmarked grave in unconsecrated ground. His greed sparked a 5-year war. His betrayal of Johnny Torrio set off a chain reaction of violence that consumed Chicago. But in the end, Dean O'Banion was just one man making one bad decision, and that's perhaps the most frightening thing of all. One man's greed, one betrayal, one moment of arrogance, and 400 people dead. That's what the beer wars taught us. That's what the St. Valentine's Day Massacre showed the world. Violence doesn't solve problems, it creates them. Revenge doesn't bring justice, it just creates more revenge, and the cycle continues until everyone involved is dead or destroyed. The last survivor of the original North Side gang was probably Bugs Moran, dying of lung cancer in a federal prison in 1957, still consumed by hatred for a man who'd been dead for 10 years. His last thoughts were of killing Capone, of settling scores that had been settled decades ago. He couldn't let it go, none of them could, and maybe that's the real lesson. Not that crime doesn't pay, though it doesn't. Not that violence leads to more violence, though it does. But that some debts can never be paid, some wounds never heal, and some men would rather die than admit they were wrong. Dean O'Banion was wrong, his greed was wrong, his betrayal was wrong. And hundreds of people paid for his mistakes with their lives. If he could have seen the future, if he could have known what his $500,000 would really cost, would he have made a different choice? We'll never know. But standing here almost 100 years later, looking back at the bodies and the blood and the broken lives, we can at least learn from his mistakes. We can choose differently. We can be better. That's the real legacy of the beer wars. Not the violence, not the killings, not the gangsters who became famous through murder. The legacy is the lesson that greed destroys, that violence multiplies, and that the only way to break the cycle is to choose not to start it in the first place. Dean O'Banion didn't learn that lesson. By the time he understood what he'd started, it was too late. The 3 men walked into his flower shop and his time ran out, but we can learn from him. We can remember. And we can choose a different path.